Have you ever really thought about, like, who counts as a real government worker in the eyes of the Philippine Supreme Court?
Interesting question.
It's kind of wild.
Yeah.
We're diving into this case today, and it involves, get this, cooks, waiters, the people who make your dinner,
Oh, wow.
and whether they qualify as government employees.
Yeah, and you know what's really interesting about this case is it all centers around PAGCOR.
Okay, PAGCOR, right? The Philippine Amusement and Gaming Corporation, for
Yeah.
folks who don't have that memorized.
Right.
What makes them so special that this is even a question?
Well, PAGCOR, even though it's government-owned, they operate under their own charter.
So their own rule book, basically.
Yeah, basically their own set of rules.
Yeah.
And this charter exempts certain positions from standard civil service law.
Which, like, governs, the typical government work.
Exactly.
So it's like a loophole, kind of.
Yeah, you could say that. It gives them some flexibility. But, and this is important, the Supreme Court has weighed in on this before, right?
Oh, really? So there's precedent.
There's precedent, exactly. Like in the Civil Service Commission and Philippine Amusement and Gaming Corporation versus Salas case, they clarified how far PAGCOR can actually go with this.
So they can bend the rules, but don't break them.
Exactly. It's not a total free pass.
Gotcha. Okay, so this all brings us to our case today. Mark Abadilla et al. V. Philippine Amusement and Gaming Corporation. That always makes it sound fancy, right?
A little more official, yeah. So we're talking about Mark Abadilla and a whole bunch of other folks over 20 who are working for PAGCOR.
Okay.
And get this, some of them had been working there for years. Like, we're talking a long time.
Dedicated employees, you'd think?
Yeah, and they held all sorts of positions, cooks, waiters, dishwashers.
Part of the house, keeping things running.
Exactly. And they were trying to get recognized as regular employees.
To get the, all the benefits and stuff that comes with that.
Precisely. And this is where PAGCOR's whole unique status really comes into play.
Oh, here we go.
Right, because they argued that their charter, that separate set of rules, means they don't have to classify these workers as regular employees.
Wait, so even if it's, like, technically government run, just because it's PAGCOR, different rules apply? That seems like, I don't know, a big loophole.
You're getting it, and that's what makes this case so interesting. In the Philippines, you've got this very clear distinction between regular government employees
Right.
and those hired under individual contracts.
Ah, okay. So this is like the whole contract versus regular employee thing you see everywhere.
Exactly.
Okay.
But it gets even more complicated when you're dealing with a government entity.
Right.
And in this case, PAGCOR was using these individual contracts to classify Abadilla and the others as either what they call contract of service workers or job order workers.
So not your typical government employee.
Not at all, no.
So if they're working for a government corporation but on these separate contracts, what does that even mean for their rights as employees? I mean, do they get the same benefits, that kind of thing?
That's the big question, right? And that's really what Abadilla and his colleagues were fighting for.
Makes sense.
You see, in the Philippines, there are several government regulations, and I'll spare you the bureaucratic jargon.
Please do.
But essentially, they lay out how contract of service and job order workers, they don't automatically get the same benefits as regular government employees.
Oh, okay. So we're talking about like healthcare, retirement contributions, paid time off, all that.
Exactly. Things that, let's be honest, most of us would consider pretty standard job perks.
Right, especially if you've been working somewhere for years, like some of these folks had.
Right, absolutely.
It's like they're stuck in this weird in-between zone, working for the government but without the same safety net.
Yeah, it's a tricky situation for sure. And, that's ultimately what Abadilla and the others, why they decided to challenge this. They felt like they were being treated unfairly.
Yeah, I could see it.
And they took their case all the way to the Supreme Court.
Wow, so what was their argument? What was their strategy?
Well, their argument really hinged on this idea of confidential employees.
Okay, I've heard that term before, but I'm a little fuzzy on the details.
So basically, it's a legal category where certain types of workers, often those handling sensitive information or in positions of high trust,
Okay.
they might be exempt from standard civil service rules.
Interesting.
So in this case, they were trying to make the argument that even though they were cooks and waiters, their work was crucial, maybe even confidential in a way.
Right, so they're like, listen, we might not be handling state secrets, but you need us to keep this place running.
Exactly.
So we deserve those regular employee benefits.
That was the gist of their argument.
Got it.
But the Supreme Court ultimately, they weren't convinced. They took a hard look at what Abadilla and the others actually did, the cooking, the serving, the cleaning, and they basically said it doesn't quite fit the bill for what they would typically consider confidential in a legal sense.
So even though you could argue that their jobs were essential to how PAGCOR operated, the court essentially said, nice try, guys, but that's not how we define confidential.
Yeah, pretty much.
Interesting. So case closed.
Not quite. And this is where it gets really interesting because the Supreme Court didn't stop at just saying, no, you're not regular employees. They actually went a step further.
Oh. Did they get spicy?
A little bit, yeah. They sent a message to PAGCOR and really any government agency that might be tempted to use similar hiring tactics.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. What'd they say? Okay, now I'm really intrigued. What'd they say?
Well, they basically told PAGCOR that just because they can hire people under these different classifications, it doesn't mean they're off the hook when it comes to treating their employees fairly.
Oh, interesting.
Right. There's a sense of, you have an ethical obligation to treat your workers fairly regardless of their employment status.
Yeah.
Which I think is a pretty powerful statement.
Yeah. It is. It adds a whole nother layer to this, right? We're talking about legal classifications and contracts and stuff. But then the Supreme Court comes in and is like, hold on a second. Let's talk about the ethics of it all.
Exactly.
So they sided with PAGCOR, I guess, on the letter of the law?
You could say that, yeah.
But called them out on the spirit of the law.
Exactly.
Interesting. So for our listeners out there who are thinking like, okay, that's cool and all, but I don't live in the Philippines and I'm not planning on working at a casino anytime soon.
Right.
What's the takeaway here? What's the bigger picture?
Well, I think it really forces us to step back and think about, who gets what protections, even in the public sector. Just because you have a job that falls under, you work for a government agency, that doesn't automatically mean you're entitled to a certain set of rights or protections.
Right.
And it makes you wonder, are there other groups of government workers out there whose employment status might surprise us?
Yeah, totally. Like, what about people who work for subcontractors hired by the government?
Exactly.
Or, we didn't even touch on this, but the government employs so many people these days in all sorts of roles.
Yeah.
What about, like, programmers, tech people?
Right. And those fields are notorious for contract work.
Totally. So it's like this case really opens a can of worms about, like, fairness and transparency in government hiring practices.
Absolutely.
Across the board.
Across the board. Yeah, I think you're right. And that's what's so interesting about these kinds of deep dives. What starts as this very specific legal case about one group of workers.
Right.
Actually has all these much broader implications for how we think about work and fairness and the role of government.
It's a good reminder that, government worker is not one size fits all.
That's a good way to put it, yeah.
And things are always as they appear on the surface. Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive, I think. I've definitely learned a lot.
Me too.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us. And keep those questions coming. Dive deep into the topics that matter to you.